We start with some signs of Ukrainian forces gaining ground and pushing back Russian forces. Intelligence reports say Ukraine has retaken ground west of Kiev and destroyed a ship in Russian-held territory. When Russia launched its invasion a month ago, it expected to take Ukraine in a lightning offensive. Against all odds, Ukrainian forces continue to keep one of the world's biggest armies at bay. But that resistance has come at a terrible price.
Flames and smoke billowing from a Russian transport ship in the harbor of Russian-occupied Berdyansk. Lines for humanitarian aid stretching in front of bombed-out apartment blocks in the heavily struck city of Mariupol. A month into Russia's war in Ukraine, every day is full of images that only weeks ago were difficult, if not impossible, to imagine in modern Europe. The sun was shining in Kyiv, and no bombs were falling for the moment as soldiers and civilians reflected on a month of war.
Ukrainians have united as never before, perhaps. This makes me very happy. And the Russians made a big mistake coming after our country, our land. We will bite their throats. It's our homeland. Morale is as high as on the first day, and it will remain so until the last day, Victory Day. We remain determined.
Ukraine has proven its resilience, but sustained bombardment, bodies in the streets, and life in bomb shelters with limited or no power or heat are bound to take their toll on even the bravest.
I feel hopelessness. One doesn't know what to do next, how to behave. I try to keep calm and only hope that everything will be over, and all will be fine as it was before, and to see the smiles return to people's faces, and our chances to enjoy life return to us.
A month ago, no one knew how long Ukraine could hold out against Russia. And yet, despite the toll to human life and infrastructure, and the sheer size of the Russian war machine, the underdog is still standing.
We can speak now to our correspondent, Fanny Fachar. She's reporting from Lviv in western Ukraine. Hi, Fanny. We saw in that report about Ukraine's reported a sinking of a Russian supply ship. Tell us more about what that means.
There's several landing ships that, of course, want to supply the Russians with very important basically things that you need to fight in this war. We are talking about fuel, we're talking about armored vehicles, we're talking about supplies. And Ukraine claims that they sank one of these ships, a landing ship named Orsk, near the portal town Berdyansk, which, by the way, is about 85 kilometers from besieged town of Mariupol. Now, also, Ukraine claims that they could make some headway in Kyiv as well, in the northern part of the city, and push back some of the Russian troops. We cannot verify that, but the videos that we have seen about the apparent destruction of that ship, of course, symbolizes to many people here on the ground that some headway is being made and that the offensive by Ukrainian forces also succeeds in some way, even though, of course, it cannot be underestimated that Russia is still very superior in terms of the number of troops, and the military, and any other elements that they have to bring forward what they call is a demilitarization and denazification of Ukraine.
So they're making headway, Fanny, you said, but is there a sense there that Ukrainian forces are actually gaining the upper hand?
That's a really good question, because there are mixed messages in a way. On the one hand, the Ukrainian Defense Ministry said yesterday that they made some progress, as I say, in Kyiv, in the northern part, and some of the troops could be pushed back. At the same time, of course, the Russian troops are known to then again come together, regroup, and to try to start the offensive again. In fact, Ukraine said that they do know that these offensives are going to resume not only in Kyiv, but also in Kharkiv, in Sumy, and other parts of Ukraine. Also in Mariupol, really a town where you ask yourself, what is there to resume? Because that town is basically reduced to almost nothing. And the people who are trapped there, even the ones who are trying to leave that city, are asking themselves where to go to. So yes, on one hand, Ukraine is trying to spread this message that let's hang in there, because we also are going to make some progress. Ukrainian military is going to make some progress here. The question is, though, what Ukraine is going to look like by that time when that progress, according to Ukraine, is completed.
And at what price, Fanny? We know that the toll on the civilian population has been devastating, hasn't it?
Definitely. Unfortunately, with 4 weeks into this war, thousands of people have been killed, and unfortunately, we can only talk about an estimate, as it's really incredibly hard just to verify the numbers, as there are towns where even journalists do not have or just very limited access to. So we need to work with the sources that we have from, be it NGOs, United Nations, and can only call it an estimate. But bottom line is millions of people have been displaced since the war began and are going to continue to be displaced as long as this massacre, actually, as the Pope called it, a senseless massacre, continues as the war continues.
DW's Fanny Fattar reporting from Lviv. Thank you for that update. And we can get some more perspective now with Halina Vasilchenko. She is a member of the Ukrainian parliament. Ms. Vasilchenko, thank you for joining us here on DW. The war, as we mentioned, has now entered its second month. Can you tell us more about what your experience has been?
Yeah, hello. Thank you for inviting, and thank you that you showed to all the world what is really going on in Ukraine. And of course, this is the worst time in our history, because in our history since we are independent. You see what is going on, and every day these miles are firing our cities, and the worst is that these Russian soldiers, they don't fight with our soldiers, they fight with our civilians. You see what they made with Mariupol, what they made with our big cities such as Kharkiv, Chernihiv, and so on. They are fighting hospitals, they are fighting residential buildings, they are fighting different administrative, our administrative buildings and houses.
Okay.
They had destroyed more than 500 educational buildings, such as schools and kindergartens. Yeah.
We've just been, as you've been speaking, Ms. Vasilchenko, we've been looking there at some of the pictures of the devastation in Mariupol that you yourself have just been mentioning. I want to ask you about the day of diplomacy and summits that we saw in Brussels. We saw NATO, of course, vow to continue to support Ukraine. We saw EU member states say that as well, but they rule out direct intervention and they rule out any sort of step that might result in an engagement with Russia. Are you disappointed in what you've seen from Western allies so far?
First of all, I want to say thank you to all governments and to all people around the world that are supporting us, and for all that military or humanitarian aid that we are gaining from EU members and from the United States of America. But I'm sure that, for instance, NATO, for instance, the United States of America, and also EU members, they can more, because as for this moment, we are not only defending our country and only our democracy. We are defending democracy and democracy of the whole humanity, of the whole civilized world. We are defending democracy of the whole Europe. And NATO, as you mentioned, it was created as the most safe alliance for safety in the world, and we asked to take us to NATO, and we are sure that if we were member of NATO, this war could not be launched.
Okay.
And even for this moment, we are sure that our soldiers, that our army meets the standards of the NATO.
But Ms. Vasilchenko, what do you think of the fact of the concerns from NATO member states that taking Ukraine in as a member, for example, could raise the threat of a nuclear war?
I think that for these last weeks, everyone in the world understood that Putin is crazy. And if he will decide to, for instance, to use chemical, biological, or nuclear war, or to start more wider war. He will do it despite are we the members of NATO or not? Whether, for instance, peacekeepers are in Ukraine or not.
If you could send one message to NATO and to the EU of what you need right now in Ukraine, what would it be?
We need to close the sky, and we need peacekeepers here in Ukraine.
We'll leave it there. Member of the Ukrainian Parliament, Halina Vasilchenko, thank you very much for joining us on DW this morning.
Thank you.
And our Brussels bureau chief, Alexander Fanaman, has been covering all the action for us. Hi, Alexander. It's good to see you. Tell us more about what came out of this flurry of activity in Brussels.
Well, Sumi, the fact that all the three summits took place on one day here in Brussels was remarkable and a strong sign of unity, with NATO leaders approving a massive reinforcement of the alliance's forces on the eastern flank and promising more military assistance to Ukraine, with the G7 leaders saying that they will hamper any efforts to circumvent Western sanctions, and the European leaders meeting with the US president and calling out Russia for its war crimes and promising Ukraine to raise money to help rebuild the country. However, when we talk about concrete outcome, that was rather limited and of course not enough from the Ukrainian perspective. NATO is still saying no to a no-fly zone over Ukraine, and the EU leaders has rebuffed Ukraine's plea for a fast-track EU membership.
And that's a message we heard directly from the Ukrainian president. He thanked EU members, the West, for their support, but also was critical of what they have not done. So let's take a look at what he said.
You've applied sanctions, and we're grateful. These are powerful steps, but it was a little late. Because if it was preventive, Russia would not have gone to war. No one knows for sure, but at least there was a chance.
So Alexander, Zelensky essentially saying there that Western leaders enabled Putin's invasion of Ukraine. How did that go down in Brussels?
Well, I think that we have to acknowledge that Zelensky has emerged as an excellent communicator who is tailoring his messages to the audience he's facing, and that was the case here as well. And I think that it went down well with some member states, with the Baltic states, for instance, or Poland. They have been calling on the EU to be tougher on Russia for years. They are pushing for more sanctions, more action to help Ukraine. And Zelensky acknowledged that in his statement, saying Latvia stands with us, Lithuania stands with us. And then he went on speaking about Germany, for instance, and he said Germany a little bit later, acknowledging that Germany was initially reluctant to imposing tougher sanctions, and that Germany is now one of the member states that are blocking a potential oil and natural gas embargo.
Alexander, tell us more about what is happening today. We saw President Biden calling for Russia to be kicked out of the G20, and we understand there's going to be an announcement as well about boosting U.S. gas shipments to the EU.
Yes, and the U.S. president was very clear that if it were for him, he would remove Russia from the G20. But of course, he knows that it needs to be a consensus-based decision, and some G20 members are reluctant to remove Russia. That is why he suggested that Ukraine should be invited to the G20 meetings. We'll see whether that is going to happen. And today, we expect a joint statement by the European Union and the US on energy, with the US expected to promise to deliver up to 15 billion cubic meters of liquefied natural gas to the European Union until the end of this year to help the EU be less dependent on liquefied natural gas from Russia.
DW's Brussels bureau chief Alexander Fanaman, good to talk to you. Countries in the Middle East and North Africa import most of their wheat from Russia and Ukraine. Since the Russian invasion, the price of grain has spiked, threatening food security for millions of people. Countries like Tunisia and Morocco were already vulnerable to food crises, especially in the wake of the COVID-19 pandemic and severe drought. But the added impact of war could lead to social unrest.
Afifa likes to offer guests a cup of coffee. It's one of the few things she still has in her kitchen. When we go to a store to buy ingredients, there isn't anything, not even flour. In many stores in Tunisia, the shelves are empty. It's just before Ramadan, and customers are stocking up on staples. They're worried about shortages, especially during these festive weeks.
In Tunisia, we import almost 40% of our wheat from Russia and Ukraine, and 80% of our flour.
Many people here do not believe the government's assurances that supplies will last for another 3 months. Prices are rising sharply. Some sellers think that wholesalers want to profit from the crisis.
There are black marketeers who are taking advantage of the war in Ukraine and hoarding goods. There's no semolina, no sugar, no flour, no cooking oil.
Morocco also imports food staples from Russia and Ukraine. Even a slight increase in prices can lead to social tensions. The government is trying to reassure the public.
All of the products that are needed during Ramadan will be available. Prices will be closely monitored so that citizens are not affected.
A long drought eroded the soil in Morocco. To compensate for this, the government has had to set up a special budget, roughly equivalent to 1 billion euros. Now the war in Ukraine is adding to those costs, which are hitting the poorer countries of the Maghreb particularly hard.